Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be here today at the University of Winnipeg to share a few ideas with you, which I call Realizing Treaty. This is the first run of a presentation that I hope to make on more than one occasion. And the reason why I think it's important that we draw attention to this matter, because we're living in a very difficult time where it's becoming increasingly important for Canadians to stop and take an inventory of who we are and what relationships we want to build for the benefit of our young ones. Now, some of you, I know, come from the communities represented by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and hopefully my presentation to you today will help you in your journey to realizing treaty, because treaty is as relevant today, in today's world, as it was the day that it was signed. And I'm going to take this opportunity as well to mark that this presentation is dedicated to the memory of my late friend Jim Sinclair, who passed away last weekend. I just got back from Regina yesterday, where we honored Jim in ceremony and put him to rest. A real rights advocate. Some of you may have known him from his days around the constitutional table in the early 1980s. We as young leaders have to look towards the ones who have carved the path for us, and Jim was certainly one of those people. So this presentation is dedicated to him today. Now, before I get into the meat and potatoes of my presentation, I think to put things into perspective and into context, you need to know a little bit about who I am. I was born right here in Winnipeg at the St. Boniface Hospital, and I landed in state custody right out of the gate. I was put into foster care before my mom came back to get me and take me back to the Pine Creek First Nation. Academically, I'm a graduate first-class honors degree from the University of Alberta. I have a law degree from the University of Saskatchewan, and I completed the intensive program in Aboriginal Lands, Resources and Governance at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. I was in process of getting my master's degree done here when overnight I went from being a bit of an older student to a young chief, and that was in 2008 when I went home to be the chief of Pine Creek. Now, when I was very young on the Pine Creek First Nation, I observed many of the traditional activities of our people. Anishinaabe was the language of our household, and although English was spoken quite a bit, it was very much a foreign language to us. My grandma only spoke our language and understood bits of English, but when she spoke, everybody understood what she was saying as the matriarch of our household. Several generations and extended family members called my grandparents' house their home, and no matter how many grandchildren and cousins were around, there was always room for everybody. And I know that to be true, and I know my sister Jennifer Nepinak sitting over there knows that to be true as well. My grandparents never prioritized money, but they were always working and keeping our household moving forward. Whether it was dry moose meat, smoked fish, or bannock on the counter, there was always food for everybody. The fresh fish came from the lake and the potatoes from the garden. Good food was always available for us. In my mind's eye, I can still see the fish heads bubbling up to the top of the soup pot in my grandma's kitchen, and many of you have those memories as well. Although I left that environment at a young age, I never lost contact with my family on the reserve, nor did I forget the lessons and the teachings that grew from the observations I made even as a young child amongst the people that I loved the most. Around my family was the only place I ever really felt wanted. It's the only place that I ever really wanted to be, and it was the only place I've ever felt that I really belonged to anything. I believe that the fundamental pieces of my identity were forged in those early years. And identity is what's allowed me to travel down many paths in this life. It's that identity is what has led me to always knowing the way home. In observing the activities of my family and others on the land, I stand here today to say that I have grown to understand that there exists a unique relationship between our people and these lands that we now call Manitoba. Indigenous families know these lands and have a very deep and rich connection that cannot be reproduced, duplicated, or imitated, either by way of the creation of external laws or through the manipulation of our people through the application of policies. I believe that what I'm talking about here is the sovereignty of our people on the lands that we have always known. No amount of legislation or policy from settler society governments will ever extinguish the freedoms and the sovereignty that I know exist in our ancestral bloodlines. After many years on the trail of life and education, I returned to my home. And I believe what happened during my trail on education was that I acquired, the textbook education, but I also spent time on the ground listening to the elders, gaining the teachings. I spent time in Dene lodges, in Cree lodges, in Dakota lodges to figure out who I was a little bit. And I was visited at times by powerful spirits that set me off in the right direction. I believe what's been produced out of that is somewhat of a hybrid learning experience that I encourage everybody to go on, all the students in here. Make sure that you don't just spend your time in the books. Get out onto the land with your people and learn the ceremonies and the ways of our people, because the teachers are here to provide that for you. When I returned home as the chief of my community in the Pine Creek First Nation, I was able to get the community turned around out of third-party management faster than any community in the history of the Manitoba region. I streamlined several millions of dollars of mortgages and freed up capital by negotiating with creditors who had used external legal processes that essentially paralyzed our community's local economy. Upon being re-elected in my second term, I received the blessing of the community elders and the leaders that I worked with to undertake a campaign for the role of Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And in July of 2011, I was elected the Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs on the second ballot. Now, the AMC, for those of you who don't know, is a Chiefs organization. It's made up of 61 of Manitoba's approximately 64 communities. Our member First Nations are called to the Assembly 3 to 4 times a year to create collaborative mandates on issues that are brought forward by our communities. Over time, these issues take the form of key policy areas for the AMC. In turn, the AMC seeks resources from government and industry to cover the costs of engaging the issues. Over the past 25 years, the AMC has created several program and service organizations in the city of Winnipeg and across the province of Manitoba. Since its creation, the AMC has brought in well over $1 billion into the Manitoba economy and has created hundreds of jobs during that same period of time. In addition to the Chiefs and Assembly, which provides my mandate, the AMC is governed by a subset of the Assembly referred to in the Constitution as the Chiefs Executive Council. The AMC Executive is a table that meets every 60 days or so to set the agenda for the Chiefs and Assembly and to address ongoing business matters that are oftentimes time-sensitive and require more immediate action. The Grand Chief is the chair of the Executive Council, and the executive members are usually comprised of chairman chiefs from the tribal councils as well as independent communities that do not have a tribal council affiliation. A fundamental reality of the AMC is the fact that although the organization is a politically representative organization, it is not a rights-bearing entity. The Constitution of the AMC mandates the Grand Chief to always protect, enhance, and promote the realization of inherited treaty rights. But the AMC is not, however, a holder of those rights. It is the 61 communities, as represented by their chiefs, that control or invoke the power of their inherited treaty rights. So when we talk about the chiefs and the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, the real power brokers are the people in the community as represented by their chiefs. And one of them sitting right here, Arlen Dumas, today. It is not the AMC nor the AMC Grand Chief. What this means in the practical sense is that as the Grand Chief, I am limited to the scope of official duties and mandates as provided by the chiefs and nothing more. This is how accountability is factored into the overall organization. This is also how the organization maintains an attachment to grassroots people and through grassroots-led initiatives that are brought forward by the chiefs. In very specific instances and where asked, the AMC may be positioned to assist First Nations in making decisions that might be understood to invoke the power of inherited treaty rights. In these instances, very specific agreements and sometimes band council resolutions need to be signed in order to effect an appropriate delegation of authority to myself or the AMC. It may come as a surprise for some to hear that to take on the role of the Grand Chief of the AMC is not an ascension to power. To be called as a Grand Chief involves a submission to duty for the service of our people. It is this teaching that keeps me grounded in the work that I do at the Assembly on behalf of our people. At its best, the AMC can be and is a political voice for the rights-bearing First Nations communities of Manitoba. The expression or realization of an inherited treaty right remains at the sole discretion of the community and not the AMC. But it is from the venue of the Chiefs and Assembly that I receive my mandate to proceed in a fashion that advances the collective interests of our community. Now, while I strive to implement these mandates, I must be mindful and exercise discretion when engaging in activity or course of action that could be construed as impeding upon the self-determining or self-governing nature of our member communities. This can be a daunting task because there are many different views amongst our communities and leadership as to the extent of the powers associated with the expression of our inherited treaty rights within contemporary social, political, and economic contexts. Notions of inherited treaty rights in today's political environment are fluid. They often give rise to confusion and create conflicts between our historical treaty teachings and the application of colonial, federal, or provincial policies, and I'll develop that concept a little more. In my own personal experience, the teachers of treaty rights and what they mean have always been our elders. Our elders have at times provided me with a gentle nudge in the direction I've needed to go in order to overcome some of the questions I've had in my leadership roles. Every meeting held by the AMC, whether it be a gathering of the chiefs in assembly or a meeting of the executive, starts out with words of wisdom and a prayer from our elders. I've also made it a practice in our assembly to recognize when an elder would like to share their thoughts on a particular matter. There can be very complex and difficult political realities that I'm asked to operate within as Grand Chief of the AMC. Often I've had to rely on fundamental understandings, values, experiences, and of course my own education. And it is from these experiences that I've grown to understand that although throughout my life I may wear several titles at any specific time or place, it's my existence as a treaty person from one of the historical treaty families that empowers and emboldens me to speak and to act on my beliefs. Now, as I've grown to understand myself and my roles in leadership, I've developed a philosophy. Now, that philosophy I call the original jurisdiction of our people. And none of these ideas are really my own. I've got to, give credit to all those elders that have informed most of the processes and the learning that I've done. Most of the decisions that I make today fall somewhere within the corners of the original jurisdiction philosophy. The original jurisdictions of the indigenous people of North America were not up for discussion at the treaty table. These jurisdictions included a comprehensive and full scope of powers that we might commonly refer to in the English language as governmental powers or authorities. These would include such heads of power as trade and commerce, language, social gathering and organization, family safety and child protection. From the original jurisdictions came the power for First Nations to enter into treaties. For example, most of the trade routes across North America were built on the treaties that were made between indigenous nations. These indigenous treaties date back thousands of years. The reason why treaties could be negotiated was because of the original jurisdiction that First Nations held with respect to trade and commerce. Our original jurisdictions are also sometimes referred to as inherent rights. Some people might suggest that the inherent rights are adequately captured in the term Aboriginal rights in Canada's Constitution, but I do not subscribe to that way of thinking. Now, the treaties that were entered into with the settler societies that wanted to live within the ancestral lands of our people are relatively new. In spite of these treaties being recently signed, we currently refer to them as historical treaties. Now, when I speak of treaties, I'm largely speaking about the ones that were signed in the 1870s and continuing into the early 20th century. These treaties are sometimes called the numbered treaties. Matters which were not spoken of in the numbered treaties remain intact. These inalienable rights continue to exist owing to the original jurisdictions or sovereignty of the indigenous communities that were present at the treaty table. The original jurisdictions are extensive, and they represent the freedoms that First Nations have yet to fully reestablish with respect to trade and commerce, language, social gathering and organization, family safety and protection, and so forth. The original jurisdictions also include the full scope of governance powers to organize ourselves politically in forms of representative government that we feel are appropriate for our people at any particular time in history. I believe it was the will of my ancestors at the making of treaty to ensure that they made an agreement with settler societies that would withstand the test of time. My ancestors wisely and with foresight made these international and sovereign agreements to allow the benefits of treaty to accrue for the benefit of successive generations of our people. I firmly believe that this is why the treaties were solemnized with the pipe. For our people, it was the pipe ceremonies that transformed and took the treaties from being mere words on paper to a place where the treaties were spiritually entrenched. In this place, the treaties were made to last as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. It was through ceremony that the treaties transcend the passage of time and became forever entrenched and fundamental to the experiences of our people in this new society that we call Canada. So whether you live here in the city or living at home in your community, your treaty is as relevant today as it was on the day it was signed. And I can see the paradox kind of created with the titling of the presentation, Contemporizing Treaty. Well, treaties are always contemporary because they're living documents. And when you live within the spirit and intent of the treaty, you'll recognize that they're always going to provide for you a fundamental set of principles from which to conduct yourself in a contemporary society. Now, throughout my education on treaties, I've heard many different stories about what the treaties meant to our people. Some believe that we were taken advantage of during the treaty-making times. Some people say that we had no understanding of land ownership and that we could not possibly have understood what it was that we were getting ourselves into. Now, I don't believe these notions of treaty making at all. I think for each and every one of you students who are here today, we have a responsibility to be proud of our ancestors and proud of our deep and rich history as the indigenous people of these lands. How could we be proud of our history and proud of our ancestors if we believed they were taken advantage of or that they were vulnerable to one-sided agreements? I don't want anybody to be ashamed of the decisions made by our ancestors to enter into treaty. I want people to be strong and proud of the depth of commitment that our people made to live in a good way with the new relatives that came from the far places of the earth. It is this same spirit that continues to live in the hearts of our elders who ask us to stand firm in our belief in the strength of our treaties. I will agree with most that at the time of treaty making, there was a very considerable difference in understanding as related to land tenure or land sovereignty. On one hand, indigenous nations of our people roamed far and wide across vast tracts of land, harvesting game and enjoying the rich diversity of foods that the lands provided to us. As land tenure experts, we had sophisticated trade systems that stretched from ocean to ocean to ocean. One of my elders once told me that the original families now comprising much of the membership of my own community, the Pine Creek First Nation, did not enter into treaty until several years later. They entered into treaty through adhesion because the moose in our ancestral lands in the Swan River Valley and the Duck Mountains were so plentiful that there was no motivation for us to come out of the bush and to make treaty with anybody. We had everything we needed right there. Our First Nations lived with extensive liberties and freedoms on our ancestral lands. The notions of freedom, as understood by us, were beyond the grasp of the European settler societies that we were agreeing to make treaty with. European notions of liberty are expressions of freedom, and those same notions as held by the settlers representing colonial interests at the time of our treaty making were very different. The settler society held a different philosophy that defined freedoms as being something that could be purchased by people with means, or alternatively, expressed and confined within the limits of statutory construction. And I think that comment, represents the great diversity and worldview and perspective that was brought to the table at the time. Ours was a fulsome freedom, fulsome